everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. I'm excited to bring you this interview. This is my talk with Professor Johanna Fernandez. Professor Fernandez is a professor of history at Baruch College, which is part of the City University of New York, and the college campus where I have spent the majority of my teaching years. I finally got a chance to sit down and talk with Professor Fernandez about all sorts of things, from her childhood in the Bronx to her experience being the child of parents from the Dominican Republic who fled that country during a very turbulent time in its history, to the path that she took in becoming a scholar and an activist, someone who is involved in the prison reform movement, and someone who has developed over the years this relationship with Mumia Abu-Jamal, who many of you know as Mumia, a figure who's kind of a prominent name in the American left. I think I tell the story during this conversation of the first time I came across the name Mumia and what it meant to me, and how I kind of Mumia, like many others, Mumia was kind of an entryway for me into a whole host of issues around racism and police corruption and a whole lot of other things, prison, big issues that I still care a lot about. So this was a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And you can find more conversations at nostalgiatrap.com and share the stuff on Facebook, Twitter. All that stuff makes me happy. I hope you enjoy. This is my talk with Professor Johanna Fernandez.
My travels to the Dominican Republic as a child were formative and offered comparative perspective.
Is your family's from the Dominican Republic?
So my parents are Dominican immigrants,
Uh-huh.
yes, and they came here in the late 60s in the aftermath of the U.S. occupation of the island in 1965. My parents were not political, but they were part of the large wave of Dominican immigrants that settled here when the nation or the U.S. government opened up the doors of the U.S. to Dominican immigrants as an escape valve for the political crisis and turmoil and revolutionary fervor that had gripped the nation. So my parents were part of that first wave of Dominican immigrants, and all of my family, my extended family, is in the Dominican Republic. Only my nuclear family is here. So my parents sent us as children to visit with family during summer breaks. And my parents' family is poor in the Dominican Republic, but it's a different kind of poverty.
Right.
And for me as a child, I was struck by the fact that I could play outside in the Dominican Republic, and there was no separation between the streets and the home.
That's really interesting, yeah.
And I felt like I was imprisoned in the building in which I grew up and could only watch what people were doing through the window. And I felt really oppressed by that. And so I started asking questions to myself, because of course my immigrant parents wouldn't answer these questions,
right?
And would have none of it. Why can I play outside in the Dominican Republic and not here?
Yeah.
And I started asking other questions. Like, there was serious poverty in the Dominican Republic, but it was different from the poverty in the United States that I was clearly aware of. And so I started asking those questions to myself at a pretty early age, and definitely see that international travel as a politicizing and formative experience.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And what about, I mean, it seems like you have there's a little bit you have to navigate in order to form a coherent, like, ethnic identity even, too. I mean, when you start thinking about you're living in the United States, but your parents are from the Dominican Republic, and at the same time, there's kind of like there's a lot of serious racial problems going on in that area of New York during that era. Was there a racial identity moment for you, or a moment where you kind of like felt like you knew who you were, or saw a group that you felt like they were who you were, if that makes sense?
Yes. So I knew that I was Dominican because my parents don't speak English.
Right.
They still don't.
Right.
And they have such a strong connection to the nation. And I didn't speak English until I was probably 6 or 7. So even though I was born here, Spanish was the dominant language in my household. And I didn't have access to the streets like my brothers did because I was the girl. So they learned English before I did. I was Spanish dominant. So I knew that we were Dominican, especially because I had traveled there as a child and fell in love with the streets in the Dominican Republic,
right,
and access to play. But I was aware growing up of race and ethnic identity because I was often read as black. And as you know from the history of the island of Hispaniola in the Dominican Republic, Dominicans have a tortured relationship with blackness. And so blackness is denied.
Yeah.
We didn't consider ourselves black. We considered ourselves Dominicans. The Haitians were black.
Right.
So that definitely created an internal conflict within me that instinctively I fought against. And the moment, ethnically, I've always embraced my Dominican culture, but racially, I embraced blackness in college. And I had the privilege of studying at a ruling class institution at Brown University, where those issues were on the table and were part of the campus discourse.
Did you enter into college with any kind of idea, I mean, not necessarily attached to race, but any idea of like what you wanted to do in college? Because we've skipped ahead a little bit, but you're at Brown, and what made you feel like that was the direction for you? At what point did you feel like you were going to go to college and you were going to pursue even an academic career? What point did that happen for you?
These are really hard questions.
Sorry.
Well, no.
There might not be a specific moment, I guess.
No. So I wasn't college bound at all. My parents had a sense that education was important.
Sure.
And they wanted me to stay in school, but they didn't really have the resources to put me on the right track. I was put in that track by teachers in my life, high school teachers who saw something in me and advised that I consider Brown. So my history teacher, my junior year, was a Brown graduate. And there was a conversation about the Cold War. And I asked questions about Russia. And I guess I was critical of U.S. foreign policy, possibly because I knew that the U.S. had invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965 and reinstated the vice president under the dictatorship of Trujillo. So these stories were told in passing in my household. And I guess I had made some conclusions. And so I wanted to hear more about Russia, because if Russia was the enemy of the United States and the United States was doing all kinds of crazy things around the world, maybe we should consider what the Russians' critiques are. So,
and you grew up during the 80s, too, when there was like a kind of very hard attitude towards the Soviet Union.
Toward the Soviet Union. Yes, on the one hand, and this was also the decade of pretty aggressive interventions on the part of the United States and Latin America.
That's right.
And I wasn't aware of that history at the time. But So I asked questions about the USSR, and for whatever reason that captured the imagination of my teacher.
He recognized you as a high achiever and wanted to send you to his alma mater.
Well, that's the thing. I wasn't a high achiever. I was
high potential then.
High potential.
Yeah.
I was a truant in high school. So I went to the classes that I wanted to go to, and I didn't attend other classes.
Right.
So I remember liking literature for some reason, and history, and science, and everything else I thought was unimportant. So she, mentioned Brown at some point, but I hadn't even heard of Brown, nor did I know what an Ivy League was. And then my chemistry teacher, Mr. Album, his wife was a member. He was on the board she was on the board of the British American Educational Foundation. And he, probably more than others, understood that if I was going to go to college, I needed some reinforcement before I got to college. So he suggested that I apply for a fellowship to study in the British public schools for a year. And I didn't know what that was, or so I applied. Yeah. I applied to the British Educational American Foundation, got a fellowship to study at Charterhouse, which is comparable to Eton in England, ruling class institution. And so I did a year of high school, advanced high school studies in England at this institution. I was hooked up with the Double Discovery program at Columbia, which is a college readiness program. And I was just rolling with the punches. I didn't really have a direction, but I was fortunate enough to have mentors, teachers, and programs at the ready that put me in the right track. I wanted to go to Wesleyan. That was my top choice. I don't know why. The Double Discovery program took us there, and I fell in love with that institution. I didn't really know much about Brown.
Right.
I didn't get into Wesleyan and was devastated. Got into Brown. Was the only school I got into. And that's where I went.
And was Brown a place where politics entered more into your life? It sounds like a little bit more. I mean, at what point are you at Brown? What general era is this? Is this?
So I applied in 1988.
Okay.
But I deferred admission for a year to study in England.
Right.
Which was a defining moment for me, because had I not had the experience of travel in Europe and rigorous academic training as I did in the British public schools, I would have drowned academically at Brown. And I would have felt more alienated than I did when I arrived there.
Did you feel alienated at Brown?
Oh, yes. The class issues at Brown were epic.
Yeah.
So this was the moment when students started acquiring answering machines and computers. And my roommate, I remembered, she gave me a list of all of the things we were going to get and how much my contribution to these things was expected.
Right.
And I was shocked.
Yeah, and it's answering machines and computers. Yeah.
Answering machines and computers.
That's what was hot at that moment.
Right.
Yeah.
So I arrived in 1989, and so I was part of the first class admitted to Brown on a need blind basis. So that means that prior to this moment, the admissions process at Brown was oriented around the ability of students to pay, in part. And so I was part of the first class of Brown students who were admitted on this need-blind policy. And so the class was had a larger number of students from the working class, but also students of color. And the financial aid officer and admissions officers who approved the policy ended up being fired over the course of the 4 years that I was there.
Wow.
So we were the only need-blind class. The others that followed were not. The admissions policy was need-aware. And so I was part of a movement that ended up occupying University Hall my junior year called Students for Aid and Minority Admission at Brown.
Yeah.
It was one of the largest student movements of the 90s. Over 1,000 students took over University Hall. And that movement just offered a vehicle for me to really understand and explore the reasons why people with whom I grew up were systematically excluded from these institutions. So that was a critical moment. And of course, I was involved in this movement because I was still intravenously tied to my friends.
Yeah.
I remember I had a ridiculously high phone bill because I was always on the phone with my girlfriend.
Remember the old
from the Bronx.
Yeah, I remember the long-distance phone bills.
Yes.
God, that was a big concern a long time ago.
Concern. Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, Brown, because of its liberal arts mission and because it's a liberal political campus, or was at the time, really offered just an incredible political and intellectual space within which to explore ideas and grow. And the fact that Brown has this satisfactory no credit option when taking courses, at least when I was there was a sense that we were all there not for the grades, but to learn, and that learning could happen inside of the classroom, but had to happen outside of the classroom in conversation and debates on campus and among students. So, yeah, it was a very rich intellectual environment for me.
It sounds like it, and it sounds like it kind of forged a connection between you're kind of like and it wouldn't even say outside, but your politics and your academic work and your scholarly work, because eventually, I mean, you end up studying social movements, right? I mean, that's part of what you write about and part of what you work on. It's like U.S. social movements and what is it exactly that?
Well, at Brown, I studied literature. And I studied literature, I discovered my junior and senior year, because English is not my first language.
Right.
So that was my way of overcompensating for what I believed was a lack,
right.
A weakness intellectually. And so it wasn't until I took a class in history, which was a popular class at Brown, but a very rigorous one, titled Social and Intellectual History of the United States to the Civil War, that I was awakened to the importance of history as a framework for understanding who we are today as a society, a people, a nation.
So it was the early period that got you into it. That's interesting.
It was the early period that got me in this conversation about history. And of course, I was involved in this major student movement at Brown, which is legendary now. But because I was in this very elite environment, and Brown is one of the most elite of the Ivies, even though it's one of the most liberal, but it really draws the most elite student body. So, the Kennedys study at Brown, and all of these other long-standing ruling class families send their children there. So I was painfully aware of class differences, and it was a playground for liberal rich children. I was aware of that.
How did you fit into that? Did you find like your own crew? I mean, that's how people usually everyone survives college, I guess, is you find your own group, and it sounds like that was in some respect like the other students that were part of this this major like bout of activism. But how did you deal with that being there? I mean, I feel like I don't really fit in with those people, like the 1%er blue bloods you're talking about, but I don't really fit in with super working class people either. So I've kind of occupied my own space. But how did you navigate that at Brown? Did it make you angry? Did it make you
there was
apathetic?
there was a lot of anger that was well channeled. I think because of the movements of the 1960s and student occupations, and the struggle for minority admission that emerged in the 60s and 70s at Brown. There was a center when I got there called the Third World Center, which organized what is known as the Third World Transition Weekend. Essentially, 2 weeks before the beginning of the semester, incoming freshmen of color are invited to participate in this program. It's a crash course on what you're going to have to grapple with on campus in terms of race, class, gender, and sexuality discrimination. And so that was formative, politicizing, and helped the transition to this very elite environment. And there, of course, I gravitated to the people who shared my experience. Yeah. There were very few Latinos at that point at Brown. I remember that I was placed in housing at the O-Zone. That's just a section of campus. And next door to me was Linda Smith, who was Haitian American. And she's the person that I most connected with, because her household was very similar to mine. Right. So we spoke the same language, interestingly enough. And then I gravitated to, I ate with the black students at the Ratty. That was the name of our dining hall. And, the Latino students didn't know if I was Latino or African American. Right. And because of the absence of strong race politics in Latin America, or progressive race politics, I just threw in the towel with, African Americans. You find it was a very racially segregated.
It sounds like it. And it sounds like racial identity had a lot to do with kind of your college experience in a lot of ways, and driving the politics part of it. I mean, is there a point where you're realizing like, I might be on the left, or I might be Did you reading Marx and coming to that? At what point is that happening?
I came to politics through literature. So I took a class with Professor Deniston at Brown, Black Women Writers, and we read the classics, The Bluest Eye, Song of Solomon, the early African-American writers, and that was transformative for me. I hadn't heard of any of these writers, didn't know that they existed. And to be exposed to the richness of that literary tradition amongst people of African descent was mind-blowing.
I bet.
And I was angry that I didn't know about this growing up. So
that's actually a fun. Jumping ahead, as a teacher, it's a fun experience to have a student angry that they didn't know this.
Yeah.
It's like you're on the right track when students are like, why didn't somebody tell me this? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That was, and of course, so I developed a love of literature, but it was always political, clearly, because I was studying African American writers. But I was also moved by the humanism of these writings, and the hankering for freedom. But it was something that was clearly present in my own life. Growing up in the Bronx with immigrants from the Dominican Republic who had grown under dictatorship. My father's story was also pretty formative for me. He was orphaned at a very young age. Both his parents died when he was 7. They were country people. He didn't go to school. So I grew up with those stories that he told about how his parents died and what that meant for a 7-year-old child in, a remote area of the Dominican Republic. So my father is not explicitly political, but he has a very strong sense of right and wrong.
And there's a literary quality to his life story as well. Yeah, it sounds like one of those novels.
Oh, my God. So I'll tell you a story that he told me, which really is probably one of the most defining stories of my childhood. Okay, so my father's mother had some kind of communicable disease. He was the youngest of 2. His older brother was needed to work in the fields. And so my father, because he was the youngest, was assigned to care for his mother. And it was expected that he would die too because he would get whatever she had. They thought that perhaps she had tuberculosis. So he fed her every day and took care of her at age 7. And the day she died, he found her dead. So that, I grew up with that story. But
yes.
So they had a little plot of land which they kept, and the uncles and aunts or brothers of the family took care of the kids. But this was a time of hardship. This was in the 1930s in the Dominican Republic during the Depression.
I can imagine.
So my father had a little pig that was his best friend. God. And he told me that he, pigs are very smart. So This is like stories that my father tells me. Pigs have, he tells me personality. They're smart, but they're the smartest animals, apparently, or among the smartest animals in the animal kingdom, according to my father.
Yeah.
So he would, he was lonely, and he was a motherless child, and this was his pet. And he didn't like to go to school, So he would cut out of school and would go hang out with the pig in the forest and would use the pig as a pillow. And they would both fall asleep in the forest. And during this period, the dictator Trujillo would fine families if their children didn't go to school.
Wow.
So his family was fined because he was missing school. And guess what they did with the pig? They sold and slaughtered, and the pig was eventually slaughtered.
God, that is endless tragedy.
Endless tragedy.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this is very literary.
Yes.
Anyway, when I
cinematic
was,
too.
It's
I
very
can imagine
cinematic.
the movie of this. Yeah.
I know it. I remember when he told me that story. He told me that story when I was in college.
Mm-hmm.
In the dark. He summoned me to the living room when he wanted to talk.
It's time for you to hear the pig story.
It's time for you to exactly. He summoned me to the living room, and my father didn't necessarily emote when we were growing up. I remember he told me the story, and I just bawled. But he told me the story in the dark in the living room for whatever reason. So he doesn't know that
Spanish.
I cried in Spanish.
Yeah,
yes, absolutely in Spanish. Anyway. To answer your question, long story long, yes, I started reading Marx in college as a junior or senior. But I was also taking classes in modern culture and media. Postmodernism was at its high tide.
Yeah.
In the 1980s. So I was especially interested in readings on ideology. And my professors, who were graduate students, in fact, were my best professors. Mm-hmm. Not, the tenured ones and the assistant professors,
but the younger students.
The younger students,
yeah.
The younger graduate students were really challenging us in important ways. Mm-hmm. And I remember doing readings on ideology and ideological state apparatuses, and that was revelatory to me.
Yeah. The media stuff really seems important. I mean, for me, it was just, it wasn't necessarily a class. It was just kind of learning about Noam Chomsky.
Absolutely.
And reading that stuff and even like, I don't know, Marshall McLuhan and like other, like kind of just thinking about media and ideology and communication and how stories and narratives are controlled and who controls them. That stuff was pretty mind-blowing.
And how we come to accept our understanding of the world.
Yeah. How reality is shaped.
Absolutely. So that was really important. And then you should know that when we occupied this building, socialist groups who were active in Boston came to campus to poke in and challenge us on 1,000,001 issues and raised important political questions about affirmative action and the political debates that were going on in the nation around affirmative action. This was also the moment of the Rodney King riots.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Uh-huh.
The verdict.
Yeah, this is like it sounds like you went to school during the George H.W. Bush administration. And
yes, absolutely. So there was a lot of debate and discussion happening in the world that didn't always make it to campus. You know how campuses can be really insular. Mm-hmm. And so I was in conversation with, just because I was one of the leading members of this movement, the SWP was calling me, and the ISO.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the professors at Brown was a member of the International Socialist Organization. So I was introduced to Marxism through those organizations, and some reading in the classroom assigned by these graduate students.
It's really interesting. It's kind of like you're having like a parallel education is happening for you, right?
No, that is the story of my life.
Yeah.
I think that's the story of most people who come to consciousness, that you're in school and school is feeding you, but it's not really helping you establish a framework for understanding the world, and so you engage in a parallel course of education. Absolutely. And that's a brilliant way of
and something emerges in between there somehow. I want to make sure we talk about Mumia because I see the poster behind you. I know that case has been a big part of both sides of your life in some ways. More on the activist side or more on the academic side. But at what point did you come to even knowing who Mumia was? Because I came to terms with Mumia from I didn't come to terms with Mumia. I first heard of him and that case just by going to anti-war rallies and his name being on posters, and I just associated him with the left when I was young because I was coming of age in the 1990s when his case was everywhere and his image was everywhere. I just knew I should know about this guy if I'm going to be like traveling in left circles. But at what point did you know about him?
Well, that question requires a long answer. So I joined a revolutionary organization immediately after college.
After Brown.
After Brown.
Right.
So a year after Brown, I joined a revolutionary organization, and a lot was going on in the world. This was the mid-'90s. Yeah. I decided at that time that I was going to apply to law school and PhD programs, not really knowing what that meant or the PhD program meant. Had no idea. I thought that going to graduate school meant that I was going to continue to embark on the process of intellectual discovery that I started at Brown. That's what I thought graduate school was about. I had no idea, none. So I also applied to law school because I was I got a sense that my parents wanted me to be a lawyer. I decided not to go to law school and decided to go to graduate school. But I haven't been driven by professionalism ever. Like
I want a T-shirt that says that.
Yeah.
I'm not driven by professionalism.
By the professional track and that trajectory. So I thought, okay, I need to travel some more, and I want to go to the Dominican Republic. Immediately after Brown, I went and studied in the Dominican Republic, independent study and travel, more finding myself, especially around issues of race. By the way, for me, the issue of race was integrally tied with hair politics. So I stopped relaxing my hair. I didn't know what my natural hair looked like because my mother started relaxing my hair when I was like 5. I have pretty big, bushy hair. And for her, relaxing my hair was probably an issue of management, but it also has to do with race. So you probably know that if you want to get bone straight hair, you go to the Dominican salon because they do the Dominican blowout.
Yeah.
So in college, I wore a hat literally for 2 years straight because I stopped relaxing my hair and I didn't know what to do. I was still grappling with the hair.
Still figuring it out.
I was still trying to figure that out.
I love this. The hair politics is great.
So I go to the Dominican Republic to study the conflict between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Anyway, while I'm there is a massive student movement around public education and rising transportation costs, but also tuition hikes. I've never seen anything like this before or since. Thousands of students go out on strike, and they're holding impromptu meetings, strategy meetings on campus everywhere. And this was some of the stuff that I read about in college. I mean, this looked like scenes of the Russian Revolution or the Cuban Revolution. It was just really intoxicating. And some workers were going out on strike. There was just massive demonstrations. But really, the environment, the political environment on campus was just the high level of politics. And I had just been through a student movement.
Yeah.
But there was absolutely no comparison.
And you're like, this is how we do it.
This is how we do it.
Yeah.
And it looked like this perhaps is what revolutions look like. So I'm there participating in these demonstrations, and I did a little writing about them. And so I come back. It's time to go to graduate school, and I decide not to go to the University of Chicago. I don't even know if I should say this. I decided to go to Columbia, even though I didn't get funding at Columbia. I got a full ride at the University of Chicago. They invited me for orientation, and I literally flew in from the Dominican Republic in shorts to the orientation.
Right.
And everyone at the University of Chicago had a suit on.
Oh, God.
In the history department. I was like, no,
Yeah.
I can't do this.
Back to New York.
So back to New York.
Yeah.
I was going to go to University of Chicago because they gave me a full ride and Columbia didn't. And there wasn't even an orientation at Columbia. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to Columbia. So you asked a question about Mumia. At the time that I got to graduate school, as was your experience, I'm sure, Mumia is like the Che Guevara of our time.
Yeah.
I had gone to these massive demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and Philly, but his case became the face of the death penalty. But there were all kinds of other things that were going on. There were quite a number of police shootings. Yeah. Anthony Baez, Amadou Diallo. This is in the late 1990s. There was a struggle to save Mumia's life in 1994 and 1995. But this was also the moment of welfare reform.
Yeah.
And tuition hikes here at CUNY and budget cuts. And I was in a revolutionary organization by this time, so I was a full-time activist engaged in what looked like pretty powerful movements. The anti-globalization movement, Chiapas happens later.
The 90s were
decade.
rough. I mean, there was also like conservative backlash against basically against black people in general, and during that year from Rush Limbaugh, anti-affirmative action, Bill Clinton's anti-welfare stuff, the
crime bill,
right? That's when
the contract on America.
Just goes on and on.
It just goes on and on. It was a targeted campaign against black people, African Americans in particular, but also immigrants. Proposition 187 in California.
Yeah, I've told that story before on the
passed.
podcast of how I watched white students at my class burning a Mexican flag during the Prop 187 stuff.
Whoa, in California?
In California, yeah. Like white they weren't frat boys. It was high school, so they were like football player type dudes, and they were burning a Mexican flag and all cheering about when Prop 187 was going up, and it was an incredibly racially awful time during this era.
Moment.
Yeah, and the riots had just happened a couple years earlier.
So this was a moment when black people were being criminalized in an intensive way, and immigrants were being scapegoated. So we were protesting in New York against everything that was going on in California. I remember going to demonstrations here. And Mumia was one of many, vibrant or important issues for anyone who was political. And so...
Well, his case combines a lot of different things, too.
Absolutely.
That's not just one issue.
There's not just one issue. It's repression because the police has just made him the poster child of their. He's the poster child for the police in terms of everything that's wrong with American society. And he was writing at this point. He wrote Live from Death Row, which was a New York Times bestseller, which in fact became a New York Times bestseller because the police attempted to shut it down as a publication.
I also I feel like the phrase "cop killer" is used a lot around the Mumia case. I don't know if it emerged from there, but that kind of notion that the cop killer is like a separate class of human being almost that puts a value on the life of a police officer higher than the lives of other people. I didn't realize. I just read this last night that in association when I was reading about the Lisa Steinberg case, which was a girl who was beaten by her parents, awful case in the 80s, but they couldn't charge him with murder, the father that had beaten his little girl to death, because they couldn't charge him with first-degree murder because first-degree murder at the time in New York State only applied if you killed a police officer. And when I read that, I just read this last night, I was like, that's something that I can't believe I didn't know. There's something I'm like, I'm angry I didn't know that. But that first-degree murder only applies if you're killing a cop is kind of like tips you off to a lot of the kind of like ideological structures of this country. It's a kind of disturbing thought.
Absolutely. And I think that point really helps us understand what happens in the aftermath of the Black Power movement and in the aftermath of the activism of the Black Panther Party.
Yeah.
So part of what ends up happening
chilling, kind of, actually.
Is that black radicals are criminalized.
Yeah.
For their influence on the black working class. So I'll repeat that. Black radicals begin to be criminalized in the 1960s and 70s as cop killers.
Right.
And they're criminalized in part because of their powerful influence on the black working class. And what we see is that this term cop killer...
Where were we? We were talking about the term cop killer and how it kind of like how that notion developed in culture as a response to not only in culture but in government as a response to the radicalism of black people in the 1960s and 1970s, and it seems like I'd never really thought of that before, but it seems like the police are going to become much more actively defensive after those movements in the 60s and 70s.
Right. So I write about this in an introduction to a volume that I co-edited with Mumia for the journal Socialism and Democracy, and the special issue is on incarceration and political imprisonment. So part of what we argue, and this is now becoming part of the mainstream, is that the campaigns of law and order, which were mainstreamed in the 1980s and 90s, and are responsible for the mass incarceration of African Americans, really have their roots in contemporary American history in the 60s and the criminalization of black radicals and the Black Panther Party in particular. As you know, the Black Panther emerges in Oakland with this campaign that captures the imagination of their generation, and black people in particular. They are the first people to initiate Cop Watch, and they did so with arms, which was legal at the time.
Legal and a revolutionary idea.
And
at
a
the
revolutionary
same time.
idea. And Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale and others went around with the Bill of Rights in one hand and exposed guns on the other, policing the police. And the reaction to this kind of activism by Ronald Reagan and others was vicious. The law was changed, essentially, as soon as black people armed themselves in self-defense. But what accompanied that was an ideological campaign by the right that painted the Black Panthers as cop killers. And so what we see happening in the Black Power movement and in the post-civil rights and Black Power movement era is that the term cop killer replaces the mythological rape of a white woman as the sure thing that will get you in prison, and if you're accused of killing a cop.
That is a tremendous historical connection. I had never really thought about it quite like that. But the police officer becomes this kind of like emblem of like of the violence of Black people,
and the police,
and an excuse for then inflicting violence upon Black people.
But also, the police becomes an emblem of the nation, right, and its values. And that institution has to be protected from, quote, predatory Black violence. And so this term is critical because it is the term that is used repeatedly to describe Mumia and anyone associated with him. So the latest travesty in this case was that Marilyn Zuniga, the teacher from Orange, New Jersey, who sent her third graders get well letters to Mumia in prison when he was sick, was fired because
I saw that article. Yeah, I saw that case
because the cops found out about this and they painted her with the cop killer brush, and it was impossible for her to hold on to her job. So so this cop killer narrative and the notion that the life of a police officer is greater than that of any other life really dominates the current political moment. It's a means of devaluing Black life.
Yeah, sure.
But that's changing with the Black Lives Matter movement.
Because I wanted to get to that. I'm glad you brought it up.
For the first time, this narrative of the police as victims in American society has been shattered. And
cameras and the internet have something to do with that. It's kind of interesting in like the sense of like, making historical connections with the Black Panthers is like, it's not necessarily even the Black Lives Matter movement doing this. Someone's there though, like policing the police with a camera. And I know the camera, it doesn't solve everything. We've seen, I watched Eric Garner be choked to death on camera and nothing happens as a result, which is, it got to be, for me, I guess I'm kind of cynical in that it didn't surprise me. I grew up with the Rodney King stuff and everything else that people get away, that the police get away with doing a whole lot of nasty shit all the time. But with Eric Garner was a case where I was like, well, it's caught on camera as clear as day that this cop choked this guy to death, and he was unarmed. It was just it was an open shut case to me, and yet there was no indictment, and that's hard. That's hard to take with the camera stuff.
Well, I think what your comment illuminates is that the ideological power of the police is impenetrable and has been impenetrable in this society since the Black Power movement.
Wow.
And so the struggle against police violence and police brutality is unforgiving. It's devastating psychologically for movement people involved, and there's absolutely no way of winning, or at least we thought.
Right.
And what has pushed the ball forward on the struggle and really revitalized politics in this nation is developments in technology and cell phones and our ability to record very easily these interactions between the police and the community, but also protest. of the violent variety.
Sure.
So Ferguson is important because people actually took the streets and rioted.
Yeah.
Much like the Rodney King riots in the aftermath of the verdict. If you recall, it was the Rodney King verdict and the riots that followed that opened up the decade to movements of all kinds, with all kinds of other things happening, but it broke the ideological malaise produced by the Reagan years. And it gave people a sense that they could stand up and fight and should.
Yeah.
So that's in many ways what we see happening around the police with the Ferguson case. And of course, it wasn't only Ferguson, right? It was also Occupy Wall Street, which had happened a few years earlier, which also dealt a blow to ideology as pertains capitalism. So for the first time in American history, it became popular to criticize capitalism. Like Occupy Wall Street mainstream critiques of capitalism.
And
huge.
Now we have Bernie Sanders running and getting a lot of resonance with a lot of voters. I mean, there is something stirring. And it's kind of interesting to see that this happened under Obama, right? Like we get the first like real big flashes. Not that there weren't flashes before between the 60s, 70s, and now, but it seems like during the age of Obama we get Black Lives Matter, which is really interesting.
Well, part of what we get during the age of Obama is a horrific white backlash to the existence of a black president.
Yeah,
which then intensifies social conflict on the ground, and probably emboldens police officers to continue to do what they've been doing for a long time. But you also have a president whose policies are indistinguishable from his predecessor, Bush, in terms of U.S. foreign policy. So there were high aspirations for American society, especially among people of color, when they voted for Obama, and for young people of all races who voted for him.
I think Obama's 8 years will be seen in some part as kind of a big disillusionment for a lot of young people.
Exactly. Yeah. And out of this disillusionment, we see potentially the birth of new movements. And
a more radical politics. Yeah, it is interesting to see it.
And a much more radical
It feels like
politics.
this election is kind of some sort of transition because the right is still just, becoming even more kind of monstrous and gross, and I don't even know how to explain what's going on the right. There's so many different elements to it, but it seems like that white backlash is located over there. That white backlash from the Obama years, the Tea Party, and all that energy is surrounding these characters like Trump and Ted Cruz and et cetera, et cetera.
And it's become larger and hairier than the Republican Party
can even handle.
Can handle, absolutely. But I want to answer your question, and this is a fascinating conversation that we could talk about for another hour. I want to answer the question of how I got involved in the case
of Mumia. To
free Mumia. So I had been generally involved on the ground as a person who frequented Mumia protests in the 1990s, as well as numerous others. And then I took a job at Trinity College, and I applied for that job during the 9/11 years. So I applied for the Trinity job the 9/11 year. And I got the job and landed there. And that was such a transformative moment for our generation.
Yes.
I wrote a dissertation on the Young Lords, but I felt that I needed to teach U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and Latin America. And I thought to myself, I was a young professor, if if a historian of U.S. history of the 20th century can't explain how we got here, then why be a professor?
Right.
So I proceeded to teach myself U.S. foreign policy in Latin America and the Middle East after World War II. And I taught a course titled America in the World, Historical Perspectives on 9/11 for 3 years. The 3 years I was at Trinity. Trinity is a very conservative institution, and the backlash from the faculty and the students...
you're going to get on Bill O'Reilly or something doing that at a school like that.
was unforgiving.
I'm sure.
The backlash.
Yeah.
But, you know, I was young and idealistic and passionate and committed. And the first year was hard, but the 2 other years were not as hard, in part because the Iraq War made the arguments for me.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, people started to question.
And connect the dots.
Over the course of our intervention in Iraq. And, of course, then it was discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction and that there was no connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. But by that time, I was completely done with Trinity. I was hired to teach there for 3 years, and I won't, in order to save my career, I won't continue on that path. But it was an important moment and training for me.
Yeah.
And there were quite a number of professors who supported me. But it was hard to be a critic of American foreign policy, as you know.
Yeah, and at that time,
during that
especially.
period, it was McCarthyism.
Yes, very much so.
Recrafted,
and even from students, I would imagine that are kind of defensive, like hearing this information. Even
absolutely. Mm-hmm. So I literally quit my job at Trinity College. Mm-hmm. There was an opportunity for me to take a tenure track job there in American Studies, and I quit my job without another job, which you don't ever do in the academy.
No.
So I was ready to walk in my truth and my path. And then at the
your hair.
And my hair. Yeah. Oh, my God, and my hair especially. Yes. By then I had locks, I think.
Yeah.
I had done away with the relaxed hair. So then at the 11th hour, and you know how this profession of ours is. If you don't get a call by February or March, you don't have a job.
Yeah. For fall. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You don't have a job for fall.
Mm-hmm.
I got a call in April or May from Carnegie Mellon. I had applied for a postdoc, and I was probably second on the list. And the person that they offered the job to didn't take it, so they called me. And so I landed at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, an hour away from where Mumia was sitting on death row. I didn't know that, but I went to an event the first day of class, the first week of classes, where who wrote A Taste of Power?
Good question.
Former Black Panther Elaine Brown. Where Elaine Brown, one of the most important leaders of the Black Panther Party, was speaking. Anyway, long story short, the students were not prepared to introduce her. She's a comedian, a very talented speaker. And she told the students, I know that I'm Black, and you think that I'm going to sing a song, but I'm not going to sing a song, so I need a podium and a mic. They got her a podium and a mic, and then she was like, well, someone's going to have to introduce me. So after half an hour, I introduced her. I was new on campus, but a professor emeritus, David Demarest, approached me after that and said, you have to go visit Mumia Abu-Jamal. I was like, what? What are you talking about? Up on death row?
Yeah.
Sitting up on death row, Mumia Abu-Jamal, what am I going to add to that conversation?
Right.
I had never visited a prison before, even though, of course, I was a prisoner's rights activist.
Uh-huh.
And so Professor Demarest, who was retired, came to my office almost every day for a month and demanded that I do this. And I finally gave in and wrote to Mumia. And that was it. I mean, it was a transformative experience, but also Russell Maroon Shoatz, another political prisoner and former Black Panther, was there, who's a brilliant mind.
Mm-hmm.
I visited him and dozens of other men on death row. And that really changed my life.
I'm sure. And you've gone back more than once. You've visited, and you've kind of developed some like a friendship with Mumia.
Right. So it's hard to, at least for me, it was difficult. And I had conversations with my friends, like what do you do when you decide to visit a prisoner once? Mm-hmm. And one of my friends said, well, if you're going to visit this prisoner, especially Mumia Abu-Jamal, you can't disappear.
There's a responsibility.
There's a responsibility attached
Sure.
to this. And actually later I learned that that prisoners experience abandonment issues because they see someone once or twice and then they never see them again. So anyway, this was an issue that I grappled with, and I developed a consistent visiting routine with Mumia when I lived in Pittsburgh, and I visit him regularly now, and other prisoners.
When's the last time you saw him?
I just visited him on Sunday.
Wow. How's he doing?
He's sick. He has hepatitis C, which, by the way, it's believed that he acquired hepatitis C when he was shot by Officer Faulkner in Philadelphia, hospitalized, operated on, and transfused in 1981. So he has this horrific skin problem that is believed to be a symptom of hepatitis C experienced disproportionately by Black people. And even though his skin improved after having been horrific, really, he had a skin crisis of biblical proportion, open, ruptured, skin bloodied, hard, completely black, painful, that had engulfed his entire body.
Wow.
His face, at some point, his ear looked like it was going to fall off.
Wow.
He's moved from that.
I had heard that he was not doing well over the course of the last couple years, I guess, right?
The last year. So he got better in the summer, and his spirits are always high. But I noted during my visit on Sunday that his skin is again really dark and leathery. And his skin crisis spiraled out of control really quickly last time he had this health crisis. So the only solution is curing him with the hepatitis C cure that is available on the market. Gilead is the company that has the patent on the medication here, and it charges $1,000 per pill at a cost of approximately $90,000 to cure hepatitis C. In India, the pill costs $4.
Yikes.
Because Gilead was excluded from the market. And the politics of how Gilead got the patent is scandalous.
Enough to make anyone a Marxist if they heard the details.
Well, it's not a long story. I'll tell you. So, Doctors of the World on the citizen's dime invented the cure. They discovered the cure through years and years of research.
Taxpayer-funded studies.
Taxpayer-funded studies. Oh, Gilead patented the drug, and the way they did it was that they added an insignificant molecule to the drug.
Tricky.
Mm-hmm. And the debates in India are fascinating because the Indians exposed them on it and said, we don't need you in our market. We're going to go with the original drug that is the drug. But Gilead lobbied the hell out of the FDA and the American government and got the patent in the United States.
Wow.
So that's that story. In any case, you should know that when I met Mumia, I was going to teach the next semester from civil rights to Black Power. So I, at that time, was teaching at Carnegie Mellon, which is a geeky school, and I had my students figure out how to get him to call the class. And the first time we attempted it, it didn't work. The second time it did, and it was one of the most incredible conversations I've ever had in the classroom. Mm-hmm. It was the first time he was speaking live from death row to a class.
Wow.
And because of the power of that conversation and the ways in which the consciousness of students shifted around crime and imprisonment, they were shocked to hear that a prisoner was so sober and mild-mannered as Mumia, because, of course, you imagine that all people who are imprisoned are predators.
Yeah. And insane in some way, cruel, vicious, crazy, yeah.
So that conversation did more for their understanding of ideology.
Yeah.
Than any reading I could have
it's not just crazy. I mean, I feel like we are trained to believe that people in prison are no longer human. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And that's why we can justify doing anything to them.
Right.
I mean, those are Hillary Clinton using the term super predator in the 1990s. She's part of the problem, that's another conversation too.
Absolutely. Anyway, so that's what.
So I just want the one last thing about Mumia. When you're talking to him, do you talk about his case in particular a lot, or do you talk about wider politics? Is he? I assume he knows about Black Lives Matter and is involved or is supportive in some way. Do you guys talk about?
So we
politics?
never talk about his case. Mumia has stopped.
It seems like it would be
talking about
exhausting.
his case pretty early in the game.
Yeah.
And he really turned his writing to the issues that had gripped the world after 1981.
Yeah.
So we talk, Mumia reads voraciously. Mm-hmm. And so we talk about Black Lives Matter, we talk about Palestine, Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm. Is he feeling the burn? Does Mumia feel the burn?
That's what he told me this Sunday. He said, I was listening to this cat, and he is better able to talk to white America than any other person.
See, that's a political mind right there.
Yeah. He was like, who else is going to talk to white America?
Right.
But someone like Bernie Sanders.
Sure.
And this is the only chance.
That's really interesting because Obama talked to white America, but he talked to white America in a different tone.
In a different tone.
And it's kind of interesting because I have people in my family that never voted for a Democrat in their life, that voted for Obama because he stirred something in them, and it was like that kind of liberal. Like, isn't it read his book and isn't it amazing that he's black and he's overcome all this and he's going to be president? In other words, it was still kind of shitty,
right? Perhaps a paternalism,
yes,
in that
for sure.
decision.
Interesting though that Mumia is looking at Sanders. Yeah.
I was surprised to hear it, but he was like, "Yeah, no, I like his talk," but Mumia is also cautious.
Sure.
About
I think we all are
about electoralism,
yep.
and he believes that ultimately change comes through the protest activity and actions and involvement of ordinary people.
It has to.
It has to. And so,
the FDR times, even show that, even when you have someone on your side in a position of power, the people are still kind of have to push that person.
Oh, right. So the second New Deal, which was the most significant in terms of producing unemployment insurance and Social Security, happened because of the massive strike wave.
Yeah.
Essentially, the working class pressured...
They made it happen. Yeah.
The FDR to deliver substantive reforms in order to prevent the revolutionary situation in this country. That's the history of the New Deal that nobody teaches, though. Yeah. I know you do.
Yeah, that they had to be pushed towards that kind of conciliatory gesture, and that they were kind of like saving the country from revolution. I mean, if you look at the the Veterans March, the Bonus March, that moment of it's kind of like an Occupy Wall Street of Washington D.C.
Washington D.C. Right,
and they wiped that out, and it was an incredibly important moment. Yeah, it's an important thing that comes up a lot on the show. I think the idea that there are leaders, but even if you're a person that believes in electoral politics, it's still you don't look for saviors. You're looking for building a politics of people, because that's the only way anything's going to ever change. Johanna Fernandez, thank you so much for sitting with me. We could talk a lot more, but thank you so much for sharing your story. I appreciate it.
Thank you.